Okay, so I'm supposed to introduce Molly, and Molly's so widely known and beloved in this department that she really doesn't need an introduction, but I'll do a little brief one anyway. So Molly got her BA at Swarthmore and her PhD at Harvard. And when I looked online this morning, I couldn't figure out in what year, but never mind, that was a while ago. And I would say to start that I think Molly is widely known and loved in this department and in her field for, first, her very keen intellect. Molly still asks the best question at every talk she's at. Second, for her great intellectual and personal integrity. And third, for her boisterous laugh. And for any
I can't let it loose.
It will happen. I can remember when we were in graduate school, my partner, John, who was also in the graduate program with me, used to say that the best thing about E10, which is the building we were in then, was Molly's laugh. It's true. It was a smaller building, and you could hear it up and down the hall. Okay, so first of all, I want to dispel any concerns any of you may have had. I got a panicked email this morning from a colleague who said, "This doesn't mean Molly's retiring, does it? Say it ain't so." Well, absolutely it ain't so. In fact, Molly's going stronger than ever. And just a few weeks ago, Molly came rushing into my office with some incredibly exciting, cool data on a pretty major new discovery. And she's now hard at work writing a grant on that cool new discovery. So not to worry on that front. Okay, so just a few things here. I remember when I was in graduate school when, for years on end, experiments would bomb and we'd get depressed. And John and I used to kind of try to, restore our interest in the field by finding a few inspirational papers that we would read to remind ourselves that it actually is possible to make progress in this field. And Molly had a paper, I can't even remember what it was called. I have a very, tattered, multiply written on version of it that was kind of a real surefire for inspiration every time. Where I would say one of the signatures of Molly's work is her insistence on really asking very fundamental questions about mind. What are thoughts like? I mean, how many psychologists ask questions like that? But Molly does. It's totally cool. Okay, so I will also say that Molly is not only deep and brilliant, as all of you already know, but also courageous. And courageous not just intellectually, but courageous on all fronts. I remember when I was in grad school, and as a sidebar, there's a weird coincidence that Molly actually owns now in Woods Hole, the house in Woods Hole that I grew up in. It's a weird coincidence, just a fact. And so when I was in grad school, there were many times that we would both be down in the Cape in our different places, and then we'd compare notes when we got back. And I remember one winter, it was really unusually cold, and the harbor froze over. And John and I had our cross-country skis, and we got to the harbor, and we thought, wow, we could ski across it. And we talked about it a lot. We thought, no, that would be really reckless. And we didn't consider ourselves wimps. We just thought that would just be crazy. And so I come in Monday morning, and Molly says, "Was that cool or what? My kids and I skied across the harbor." I'll also note that among Molly's many other activities, that's great, I loved it. Among Molly's many other interests and activities, she and I and a few of our friends have been engaged in some rather controversial politics from time to time. And around 10 years ago when this got going, there was a very difficult moment when the press took an interest, and we all panicked and thought, oh my God, who's going to go on Fox News, and who's going to talk to reporters, and who's going to do all this? And I can remember Ken Nakayama saying to me, "We have a secret weapon, Molly Potter. She'll fool everyone. They'll think they're dealing with this nice, grandmotherly, sweet lady. They can push her around." Not so. It was great. Yeah, she was fabulous. Yeah, Molly is formidable. Okay, I'm not going to go on much longer, but the one other thing I need to say is that Molly's also unusual in her incredible generosity. And so I remember when I was in grad school talking to Molly until well into the evening, and it was Molly would say to me, "Oh, do you need to go?" And I think, when I'm sort of scheduling meetings with students, a week ahead, I'm thinking, God, I got it so lucky, and nobody does anymore. But it was a real privilege. Okay, just one other thing. Beyond her incredibly fundamentally important papers, a big part of Molly's impact is the people she's trained. And so I went on NeuroTree this morning, and I counted 15 direct intellectual children, 87 intellectual grandchildren, and a large number of intellectual great-grandchildren, one of whom will be enrolling in our PhD program this fall. I'm not sure you've even met him. I'll tell you about him. Okay, so all of you are invited to ask questions, but I thought we'd start by getting Molly to talk about early stage of her career and how you got into the field. I don't know if you want to go all the way back to Swarthmore or Harvard or what.
Well, I'll go all the way back to Swarthmore because I see Ruth back there, and she's also a Swarthmore graduate, and we tend to be pretty loyal, chummy in-group here, even though there are not many of us. It's a pretty small space. But it was a great place to go to school, and I didn't know anything about anything. I had grown up in Lebanon. The country of Lebanon was where I was as a child. My parents were there as teachers and such. And so I kind of came to this country naively to finish 2 years of high school before I applied to college. I didn't know where to apply to college. I just had a friend who said she was applying to Swarthmore, and it sounded pretty nice, so I applied and got in, which had a big effect on the rest of my life for two reasons. One, I got interested in psychology there because I took a course in my sophomore year with Henry Gleitman. Henry Gleitman will be known to younger people perhaps as a textbook writer, and to the very younger people will not be known. But he was then a fresh new faculty member who had just finished his PhD in Berkeley, working with Tolman's group, I think, certainly working with rats. And he was a fabulous teacher. So it's no wonder he wrote a great textbook, introductory textbook later on. So I thought, oh, this is cool. You can do these experiments and reach these conclusions. This is lots of fun. So I committed myself to major in psychology. And then I had a couple of seminars there, one with Wolfgang Köhler and the other one with Hans Wallach, which were both sort of influential and important in my understanding about Gestalt psychology. I didn't entirely buy it because there were some other views out there developing at the time, like Gibson's, that were considered heretical by the Gestaltists. But so I knew that there was a range of views, but it was pretty inspiring to be able to talk with those people and hear about how they reasoned and how they did their experiments. So that was the importance. One importance of Swarthmore, it led me into the field. The second one was that at the end of my sophomore year, I spent a summer in a sort of a work program of sorts, and my future husband, who was a fellow student at Swarthmore, was also in that program. And somehow or another, we got together. And the day after graduation, we got married. And my husband is still happily with me and happily doing neuroscience, the serious stuff. And so that was a huge factor in my life. Okay. So after Swarthmore, I thought, gosh, this is fun to do. This is good. I better go to graduate school. My parents didn't think it was very practical, but fortunately they indulged and let me go. And I went to Harvard after having spent a year as a secretary to Jerome Bruner. I needed to be in this area because my husband was going to graduate school in the biology department at Harvard. And in those days, there wasn't much consideration for the fact that that two people might find separate tracks as ways to get started, you were generally expected to pick the person with the more powerful career and go along with him. And the assumption was that person would be your husband. And since my husband was a very dedicated and hardworking and smart biologist, I had to agree. Yeah, that was the serious career. But it should be understood that he did everything throughout his career, but particularly after the feminist movement in the 60s, to help and promote my career. So he was a wonderful cooperative partner throughout. Okay, so then I started graduate school at Harvard, and I was in a department with Jerome Bruner, who was my advisor, which had separated off from the psychology department because the psychology department was heavily into Skinner at that point. Skinner was the major figure, and there were people who were thinking a little differently, other than Skinnerian approaches or the other SR models of the time, behaviorist models of the time.
So Skinner was in psychology at
the time. He was in psychology. So some people like Bruner, who was a young faculty member, broke off and said, let's form a group that can think in a different way about how the mind works. People who are interested in social psychology and social other kinds of things like sociology, anthropology, clinical psychology. So those groups got together and formed the Social Relations Department. Just a strange name, but that was the department. So that was a nice sort of free thinking period from 1953 when I started there, in which these ideas about what turns out to be cognition, I don't think we were really calling it that at the beginning, were being batted around. People were interested, for example, in linguistics at that time because of ideas of Chomsky's and others. And George Miller in the mid-50s published his 7 plus or minus 2, and a lot of things were going on to try to think about studying the field in a different way than the behaviorists were studying it. So that was the kind of department I had around me that I was fortunate to have. It took me a long time to finish my degree.
Oh, can I just go in for a second?
Yep.
And ask you to elaborate, because this is sort of interesting and news to me, because there are all these sort of modern histories of the origins of cognitive science.
Yeah.
And they usually start later than that. So
well, they pick a time like 1956 or 57. When was that? When was the big big meeting that in which in MIT's term they highlight that because it happened here, but but it was the same group of it was the same people.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. And so I don't think people entirely understood there was something new happening, but certainly Bruner knew that there were behaviorists who didn't like the kind of work he was doing, so he was kind of in the forefront of finding doing something a little different.
What was it that Bruner was doing that the behaviorists didn't like?
Well, he was trying to understand, for example, how people could learn concepts, and so he did experiments that now seem look awfully primitive, but they're not unrelated to kinds of things that have appeared in a more sophisticated form. For example, in Josh Tenenbaum's lab, and what he did, for example, was to generate a set of cards on which were printed, patterns with 4 different features, and the features could vary, 3 values of each feature, and then he would ask subjects to figure out by guessing on each successive card, is this an X? Is this a target? And then they would guess yes or no, and then they'd be told, is this an exemplar or not? And they would go through the pack and try to figure out what's the concept that underlies what constitutes an exemplar. So that was, it's a sort of primitive way of trying to figure out how people could extract concepts from combinations of attributes. And so, that underlies the way we think about it now, but again, you look back and somehow those experiments don't seem very sophisticated. But he wrote a whole book about that work and some other related work done by the group there called A Study of Thinking. well, you know, that's just quite ambitious to say I'm studying thinking, right? So he was around, George Miller was around, Roger Brown was around in social psychology, coming up with new ideas. I was a TA in Roger Brown's course, which was quite exciting. Yeah. And I remember he was a model of how one should give lectures, but rarely do, which is in the sense that he would just come up before the class, no notes or anything, and he would just stroll back and forth, and out would spin what came later to be his book on social psychology. So coming smoothly and beautifully out of his mouth, and just inspiring you. He said, "Oh yes, that's the way it must be." You know, it's really, really inspiring. And there's no PowerPoint, no nothing, just this beautiful, intelligent lecture. So I've seen Tomar give a lecture like that. It's one of the few people I've seen do it. So maybe Tomar is the upcoming, not Roger Brown, but you know, whatever. Okay, so that was that era. Now I was slowed down. I was going to tell you, it took me from 53 to 61, count up 8 years, to get my PhD. Well, why did it take me so long? Well, in 56, after he had been in school for 4 years and I had been in school for 3, Dave finished his degree and got a postdoc in London at University College. And this was terrific. This would be such fun. And so I made arrangements to go to University College as a visiting student and continue to do at that point, what I needed to do, which was to do research for my PhD. It took me about a year there to get their people to build me the equipment I needed to do a simple piece of research on signal detection, which was my thesis. My thesis is a non-memorable, non-published event. It's quite thick, but but I can't say it's particularly wonderful, and it has the limited number of experiments in it would shock any current student who is getting their degree. But it took a lot of work to do it. So the equipment in this case was something that would produce sounds of different loudness that I could give to students so that I could test whether I could influence. I wanted to see whether I could follow signal detection rules of influencing their judgment about whether this was a loud one or a soft one, categorically, by two things: by the probability that it actually would be, which could be greater than 50%, like 75-25, or by payoff, right? And so I was giving them pennies, right. I was giving the pennies. And I discovered in Britain, at least, I thought it might not have been true if it had been here. In Britain, they were appropriately responsive to the change in probabilities, right? That did influence them in the expected way, but the payoff did nothing. It did not change their judgment. So they were clearly separating the motivation from the payoff from their experience of probability, which I think is a kind of neat result. So those two things are not equivalent in the way they were expected to be by signal detection theory. That was my thesis. That was it.
I always thought it was your thesis work. I guess it was something else you did in graduate school. The thing with the blurry pictures coming into focus.
Yes, the blurry picture came afterwards. That was postdoc work. Okay. That was postdoc work.
You should tell people about that.
Right. Okay. So anyway, why did it take so long? Well, partly because I went to England, but secondly because at the end of that 2 years in England, I had a baby in England. So I have a daughter who was born in London. And that was all according to plan. Everything got very planned in our family. We thought that's great. It was high time. My in-laws were getting impatient when we were going to have children. And this has been 6 years had passed. Why did it take so long? And so they were very, very pleased. I said, oh yeah, we were always going to have children. We were just going to wait for the right time. All right, so I had one child, and then I had a second child as I was finishing up writing my PhD. So I was fitting up the analysis of the data, which, believe me, was complex because it was done on computers, but punch card computers, and I had to give it to a specialist to give me the numbers, right? It was nothing I could do myself.
That must have been very cutting edge of you at the time to be using computers rather than...
I don't know. The punch cards, yeah.
Right.
I don't know. It just seemed to be the only way you could handle that amount of data. Anyway, so I was doing that, having one child and then the second child. And then after that, I always knew I wanted to be working. And so I asked Bruner, well, could you can you help me figure out how to get a part-time job, a half-time job? And he said, oh, well, maybe you can start out with us, kind of like, we can see how it works with us. So I worked with him and his group for several years. At that point in 1960...
Wait, that's a faculty position or that's...
No, just a postdoc or a research appointment of some kind, right? And he was willing to do it part-time, so he was an angel in that sense. In 1960, which was just as I was wanting to start work and so on, he founded the Center for Cognitive Studies, and it was the first Center for Cognitive Studies, right? And it lasted about 10 years until he went off to Britain and spent all that research money, much to their anguish, on something else having to do with infant learning. Okay, so Bruner and Roger Brown and George Miller ran that center, and the great thing about it was that they brought lots of psychologists who would come and spend a year's sabbatical or come for an extended research visit or something like that. So he had a lot of people coming through, as well as people like myself who were students or postdocs doing work in that group. And so that was really a wonderful way to be filling up time when I had 2 more children during that period. So at that point, I ended up with 4 children. And look, people ask me, how can you do this with 4 children? How could you have had 4 children? Well, my answer, my honest answer is I couldn't have done it without the job. I needed to be able to have some other part of life. I'm not a very patient person, and I just, I couldn't spend 24 hours raising children. That wasn't really, well, I could have, but the thing is, it wasn't very satisfying to me, and it didn't make me a very good parent to be impatient, like, don't bother me, I'm reading. That's not so great when you have 4 kids running around. So being able to get out of the house and go to a place where I could be doing something intellectual for a total of sort of door-to-door, 6 hours away from the home or something like that was what I typically set up with people, was really helpful. And I love having 4 kids. Let me immediately say that none of my kids have 4 kids. They have either 2 or in one case 3. So I think it's much more sane to choose to have 2 kids if you're trying to do this kind of thing. But at that point, somehow, it seemed as though my career was just going to be kind of what I could fit in around other things. And so I can't say those years of postdoc were tremendously productive. They did involve this one study that got published in Science, which was a great way to start your published life. Bruner was the first author. And the idea had originally been Bruner's, but I was the one who did the work on it. And the idea was to show pictures starting out of focus that you couldn't see possibly what you were looking at. And then you bring them gradually into focus with a kind of machine that Bruner developed that kind of moved the projector so that it would move gradually into focus in a measurable way. And at every point, the person was asked, keep telling me what you think you're seeing, what you think you're seeing. And eventually, suddenly they say, whoa, that's a fire hydrant. All right, that's the famous one, is the picture of the fire hydrant. And what the discovery was that if you took that same level at which the person couldn't yet see that it was a fire hydrant, and showed it to a naive person who just walked in the room, they'll immediately see that it's a fire hydrant. In other words, it seems as though there's some perseveration of the way you're interpreting the picture that lasts later and later, leaving you thinking you don't know what you're looking at when anybody walking into the room can immediately see what it is. So it's a striking phenomenon. It works very well. It only works with some pictures. You have to have pictures that, out of focus, push you to a different figure ground organization usually, or some other properties of the picture that lead you to a misconstrual. But the logic is the same. Even though you can do it only on a subset of all possible pictures, it's still, the principle is right, which is you can get started seeing something one way. It's a little hard to reverse yourself, right? And similarly, if you start with the person looking at it in focus and take it slowly out of focus and ask when they can no longer see the fire hydrant in this example, that will persist. Your ability to see it will persist a long time. Now, there's a similar phenomenon, for example, that Aude has shown with her hybrid pictures, that if you see that you're looking at Marilyn Monroe, and you move yourself gradually further away and then realize it's Einstein, or vice versa, whichever way it goes with that illusion, again, you have that persistence in the direction from which you start. And so that's a nice, robust phenomenon. It turns out that actually there was some work a little bit like that in the 30s that had shown it, but somehow or another, this fuzzy pictures work was interesting to people and made a bit of a splash when it was published. So that was a nice sort of start to my career. At that same time when I was working there, though, I got interested in something that has preoccupied me ever since, which is how we remember pictures that are seen for the equivalent time of an eye fixation. What's happening as we move our eyes around all these times? I mean, we're moving around 3 times a second. Each of those is like a picture. Are we remembering all those pictures? What's happening? Do we even recognize what's on those pictures? Is it only that we kind of already knew from the previous fixations what the next one would be? Could we really see something in 1/3 of a second if we're shown something again and another thing and another thing? And so that's when I started using this technique called RSVP. I didn't call it that. That was a nice name that Ken Forster came up with for this technique, standing for rapid serial visual presentation. So I started using these films. We had to take films, single frame photography. We had to have a way of controlling the rate of presentation. And what was available then were projectors designed for football teams so that they could analyze a previous game to see what happened and how it worked. So they needed to be able to film it and then show it, slow it way down so that they could see what was going on. So those projectors existed. They cost an inordinate amount of money, but Brunner had money at the center and was willing to buy a projector that would do this work for us. So we made these films and showed rapid sequences of pictures and found out some basic things, namely, even though you seem to be able to see the pictures at that rate, you're not remembering very much about anything you see at that rate. It doesn't stick in your memory. So we showed that, but we were confident that you could see what was in those pictures in 1/3 of a second. Certainly if you showed a single picture for 1/3 of a second and then showed a visual mask, you would have no trouble seeing and remembering that particular picture, as long as you didn't have to see another picture, another picture, another picture, right? And a little later after that, we began the test of asking people to look for something, a particular thing, and showed them the sequence and said, do you see it? And we showed at different rates. We showed that if you tell them ahead of time what they're going to be looking for, like 2 people drinking or something like that, even though it's a very general description, people will have no trouble saying, yes, that was it, right, when they come to it. And so we realized then that there's a huge difference between your ability to detect what's there and your ability to represent it in memory. You need much more time to pay attention to a picture if you're going to remember it even in a minute or two later. Okay? So that work, in a sense, our discovery that Nancy talked about is that we can do that even faster than we believed possible in those days. At those days we thought 10 a second was enormously fast. Well, it is. It's really whisked by. And so it seemed astonishing that you could recognize a picture at that rate. But now we're finding you can do it at 13 milliseconds a picture. And that strikes us as even more surprising, although people in visual psychophysics, like I have to be for this, have to figure out whether they, in some sense, are seeing it in that time frame or whether they have a representation that outlasts the 13 milliseconds sufficiently so that what they're really seeing, what they're really responding to is something that's happening in the brain a lot later than the initial arrival of the 13 millisecond view. So that's what we're going to try to figure out in our research proposal. So that sort of brackets my whole career.
You know, I'd love to hear how you were first hired at MIT and what your
Okay, I'll tell you about that. I give you, Nancy says one of the reasons, I think this is true, one of the reasons to talk about one's career is not just say, gee, I did this, I climbed this mountain, I did this other thing. That's everybody is going to have some points like that in their life. It's a little bit to say, how did it work out that it worked out that way? And what were the points where there were problems? And how were they overcome? Is there anything to be learned about that? So let me just talk about that a little. So as I say, I've imagined my career in those days as fitting in where it could, not as a predetermined thing that would definitely happen. It wasn't, it was clear to my husband that he was going to have a career. He was going to be a scientist, he was going to be a teacher, this is going to happen. In my case, it was, well, I'm going to try to do it. I'm going to try to do something like that. I don't know what it'll be. It'll fit in as best I can, all right? So the part-time work during those, the number of years after I actually finished my PhD, and actually the part-time work I was giving when I was finishing my PhD and having all these kids, there might have been a 10-year period there where I was never working more than half-time, and sometimes not that much. Like in the summers, I often couldn't do any work at all, right? Because I was with the kids. So it wouldn't have seemed at that point, if you were rational, to think that I would actually ever have a regular job. Just didn't seem as though that would be in the cards. And I didn't know myself for sure that it would work out. So when Bruner was finishing the center and it was clear that I wasn't going to be able to stay there any longer, I'd run my time out, I looked around for other jobs. And I was asked by the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, there's a person named Kevin Lynch here at MIT. There was a person named Kevin Lynch who was a very interesting original city planner who had written a book called The Image of the City that talked about how people represent cities and spaces in their mind. And so he and his colleagues were interested in something they then called environmental psychology, which didn't mean what we think of environmental psychology now as being green. But the term then simply meant the psychology of the way people look at their environment, their physical environment, particularly the built urban environment, and to some extent the interiors of buildings and so on like that. And that was a kind of a new field, and they wanted somebody who would come to that department and teach it. So I said, okay, I can do that. After all, I had just been studying how people pick up information from pictures, sort of roughly like eye movements, and so it seemed as though I had some sort of background that might be relevant. Actually, I had no background worth a damn, but I had learned from my colleagues, and there was a new literature in this field, and it wasn't all that hard to put together a course to teach. But I wanted to continue my research on, particularly on these rapid pictures. I actually got a small one-year grant, I think, from NSF at that time, probably my first grant, and two people, Estes and Erickson, two people who are well-known but passé psychologists, I guess Estes still alive, came to MIT at the beginning of my time there in 1967 to see whether they could give me money. And they were, I showed them my rapid pictures and gave them my, Jill, and they were very shut-mouthed. If you know them at all, they're very quiet people. And, and they went away, and they gave me a year's worth of money just because maybe it would pan out. Anyway, my first grant. Okay, so and I've had the conditions of my doing research. I was lucky enough, most of the time, somebody or other arranged to have me have a research assistant. This was really helpful. To do the research by hand, by yourself, without anybody is not so easy. So I was lucky that people were willing to give me this as part of my job, right? I was also perhaps lucky that Teuber in the psychology department, I knew people there, and I would go over and go to talks and things to keep my psychology up. But Teuber needed somebody to teach social psychology. They had just not given tenure to the person who had been there, who had been teaching that. Social psychology was important as an undergraduate course, partly because the Sloan School really wanted somebody teaching this. And so Teuber felt it was in the interest of the department to have somebody teach it. He asked me if I could teach it. So I sort of fitted it in 1970 around the other things I was doing for nothing, so to speak, because there was nothing he could give me under the MIT system. He couldn't give me extra money or anything to do that. And then he apologized by saying, oh, gee, he hadn't realized he couldn't give me anything. And I said, no, that's all right. I said, I'll do it if you give me an office and some space. So he gave me an office in the psychology department and office and lab space. And he also paid for a research assistant, a wonderful research assistant I had there for several years, named Barbara Faulkner. And she was terrific, and I did my research in the old E10 building that has now disappeared and is a glossy new media lab associated building. So I was able to continue my research and have new colleagues there around me. Various people like Wayne Wickelgram, who subsequently went elsewhere. Now, one of the things I did to sort of rev up this is to consider all of the people who are still around, who were in the department at that time. And it turns out that there are 10 of us. I wonder, these are all people who have been around in the department or related to the department for over 40 years, friends. This is pretty astonishing. And you can probably figure out who. Some of them are here, I'm happy to say, including Dick Held, one of the major figures. And also in that time, the department, partly because of look, there were 9 people in the department. Dick, is that right? 9 people. 9 faculty members in the department, 9, of which 4 people were cognitive, vaguely cognitive. 2 of them were associated with language, Jerry Fodor and Merrill Garrett. Jerry Fodor had a joint appointment in philosophy, and was, if you know anything about Jerry Fodor, he was a live wire. He was a very stimulating person to have around, right? So there was the two of them and me, and they appointed Sue Carey early on, I think about 1971 or something. By the way, I had run into Sue Carey as a brilliant undergraduate at Harvard back in the mid-60s in the Center for Cognitive Studies, where she was just one of these people who came to those seminars who was just exceptional, right? And then she went on to get her degree. Anyway, so we had Sue Carey, and that was really the cognitive group, really. That was it. Then we added, eventually we added people like Osherson and who else? Well, of course, Pinker came. You know, people came and went in these different fields. Eventually, Carey left, and Spelke came, and so on. Right.
Molly,
So but the cognitive group was pretty damn small, smaller than it is now, by far.
But a bigger percent of the department.
Yes, that's right. It was 4 out of 9.
So Teuber had this vision of linking all the levels
Yes.
of the department. So were you guys all talking to each other back then? How did that go?
No, not so much. Not so much. Not so much. Yeah, I think it was still a little bit separated, but I think we were all well acquainted with each other. I mean, you have a group that small, everybody knows everybody. Everybody is sort of friendly and on speaking terms. Well, I guess they were all on speaking terms with each other. And Teuber, well, it was really an exceptional man. He was brilliant. He could be quite manipulative and quite effective with the administration. So he was complex, but he certainly was essential to the sort of establishment of the department as a presence, and his idea from the beginning of pulling in neuroscience with his own training in neuropsychology, to pull in neuroscience by having a brilliant neuroanatomist, Nauta, come and be a member of the department. I mean, an amazing coup, really, in many ways. And then Emilio Bizzi, and then he'd already had Peter Schiller, and Jerry Schneider was a student and stayed on. And then, of course, Held was there as a major figure throughout, and took over after Teuber died. You know, it was a dynamic scene, even though it was a really small group, until in the mid-'80s, when MIT decided to put neuroscience in our department, attached to our department, instead of trying to grow it in biology. I mean, I think that's a very interesting story by itself. Why didn't neuroscience, why couldn't it take hold in the biology department? I think the answer, I don't know for sure that this is the answer, but my understanding is the answer is this: molecular biology was so big, so powerful, so dominating, that you couldn't grow something that wasn't really part of molecular biology. And at that time, neuroscience, the contact with molecular biology was relatively minimal. It was systems. Is this the answer, Anne? Is that the reason they couldn't grow it? Right. Right. And I forgot to mention that, of course, Anne was she's one of my 10 who were around in the olden days. Anne was there when I first contacted the department. She was a student. She was a graduate student. And she was working with Nauta. And then she became really his natural successor and evolved into, you know, a person who does molecular biology, among other things, right? So you sort of embody the whole change. We could put you up. You embody the whole change in the department.
I have to tell you for one moment, who was it who inspired me in this moment?
That's sweet of you to say, you know. But I think it's really interesting, because I think you do show just exactly where Teuber wanted to go, and you represent, you know, the natural heir to that, which I think is fabulous. I guess you never probably saw his manipulative side. No. You were just a student. You were a faculty member already before he died, but anyway. But you know, I want to bring out that these people are human beings, including Toiber. Exceptional human being, but he was just a human being. We were all, that's what we were. And very imperfect, I have to certainly say for myself. I think times have changed enormously. The amount of work that people do now is much, what it requires, what's required to be an effective faculty member is so intense now that it's really a hard life. It's like going into the mines. You know, I think it is hard, but on the other hand, it's also appreciated. I mean, the world knows that this is the era of the brain, and you guys, collectively, we're studying the brain. So we're working at the heights, in the ideal situation, at the heights of, I don't know, intellectual scientific development in the world. And so if it's hard work, there is a kind of reason, because you're doing the most important thing there is, I think, and you could argue in many ways, right? But I'm sad in a way that you can't do it in such an amateurish way as I think I have to say I did. So, I admire those of you who are going into this career now. I think it is tough, but I think it's worthwhile, and you should, you know, I hope you feel lucky that you have a chance to participate in this wonderful field. Anyway, I wanted to say a couple more things just because I wanted to make clear about the glitches, and it's much easier to just go over what happened that worked than it is to remind myself of the bad times. I shouldn't have gotten tenure because I hadn't published enough and intensely enough, I think, certainly by present standards, to get tenure. I'm glad I got tenured, and I feel that it was the right thing, but it wasn't. In some objective sense, I think you look back at my record, you think, how did she get tenure? And you'd be right, how did she? I think it was recognized that the work I did, even if I was doing it slowly, was some of it quite good. And so in that sense, I guess it was okay. But it wasn't totally natural.
You're probably the only person who had that thought. And the other thing I would say is I think there probably was, correct me if I'm wrong, more of an emphasis on quality than quantity back then, and it's a real loss that we've sort of lost track of that, and that you have to not only do good stuff but do vast amounts of it. That's a real unfortunate turn in our field.
I would say that I think it is. There are many ways. I can't quite picture what, you know. It's hard to picture what your life would have been like if things had been, if I hadn't taken that first job at MIT or something like that. I can imagine things could have been entirely different. So a lot of this is chance and luck, but it's also sort of taking advantage of what is available to you and trying to, you know, do the best you can with what opportunities you have. So I think the thing is not to give up if somehow your pictured ideal career doesn't unfold for you. You still, you know, there'll still be routes that you can find to do good work and to have a satisfying life. So I feel I've been exceptionally lucky, but I think the message is make your own luck in some way or another, I guess. I don't know.
Great. Maybe we should take some questions from the audience.
I'm sorry, this is going on rather long, but I'm very happy to take questions.
Can you talk about your very early years in Lebanon?
My early years in Lebanon, what can I say? I think there's something great, by the way, about growing up in a different place, a different culture than right here, or maybe in this culture, but in a different culture than the academic one. I think that moving cultures is very stimulating. It gives you a kind of, for me, gave me some sort of freedom, because I didn't feel at any point that the culture I was in at that moment, like I left Lebanon when I was 10 and I went to Canada, and there was a whole different scene in a very small town. And I had known something different, so I didn't have to take, to believe everything anybody said, or to believe that the values that people were expressing were necessarily the only values available. So it gives you an independence that I think gave me this kind of what you call courage, but it's just a feeling, I don't have to take that, or that might not be true. And it sort of left me able to be a sort of contrarian for the rest of my life. And I felt that this is actually a pretty good kind of attitude to have in science, which is, do I believe that? You know, does that evidence, does that stand for that, or is there another interpretation? I felt as though that was available to me because I had known a different, and eventually several different kind of cultures and environments. And I think it's great that I know many of you have also sort of switched environments, switched countries, or switched cultures in some way. And I wonder if you wouldn't agree with me that it gives you a kind of freedom. You know. Okay.
Other questions? Jim.
Just following up on that, just a bit more, excuse me, about the willingness, or the sort of how the department feels to you now in terms of people sort of saying, you know, I disagree with that, or sort of being confrontational rather than sort of a little more passive. I'm echoing sort of some of my students that have come in and sort of found this place to be not as confrontational as they would expect it to have been. That there's a lot more deference, and I don't know if it's like that. And to be honest with you, I agree with that based on my experiences outside as well. So, yep. I mean, people don't come in and they get seminars. We sit here largely passively and sort of maybe ask a couple questions nicely at the end.
Yeah, I think we're more polite.
Versus, was it always
even
like that?
In my little window of time, that's changed radically.
Yeah, yeah. Is it? I mean, one reason for that might be when the group gets very large, it's hard to have confrontations because they use up time. You feel as though, okay, you've got this argument between two people. There are 50 other people out there who are just waiting for it to finish, and so if you have a kind of a smaller group, you can go at it a little more. And so I think somehow also the spread of knowledge, such that we don't all share the same knowledge by any manner of means. We don't, you know. We don't have the same core knowledge from which we can argue, so that when you put forward an argument, everybody's going to understand it. It is, the fields has gotten so specialized and so big that I think that is part of the problem. I don't know. Do you have any? Do you think? Yeah, why do you think it is?
That seems like a plausible account, but I also think maybe it goes in phases. I remember when I was in graduate school in this department, we were so obnoxious. I mean, we thought it was our job to be as rude and nasty as possible to every speaker. I mean, we were just intolerable, and we were proud of it. And I can remember when I took my first postdoc at Berkeley, I had been there for 2 or 3 weeks, and a speaker came through and gave a talk, and I thought it was crap. And I, can you explain blah, blah, blah? And she does blah, blah, blah. And I say, you didn't answer the question. The question was blah, blah, blah. You still didn't answer the question. I cringe thinking about it, because I think being hard-hitting is important, but being an asshole is not necessary. Well, I was called into the principal's office, into the head of the department's office after that, and Irv Hafter, who's become a dear friend, lovely person, said, Nancy, we don't behave like that out here. And I'm mortified to recount this story, but I'm so glad that he socialized me. I just kind of unthinkingly followed this habit that we all did here. And I can remember Steve Coslin giving a talk, and John, for whatever reason, I was not involved in this, but John, my partner, just decided that this was intolerable, and he went at Steve. And I had actually been working in Steve's lab part-time, and Steve later told me, I'm never giving a talk at MIT again. So that's a little extreme, but I do wish, especially, that more of the grad students and postdocs would go to talks and ask questions. And I think they, some of them do, obviously, but less than I remember and less than I think is good. And you ask them politely. You can ask a hard-hitting question very nicely.
Yeah. So.
I wonder what you talk a little bit about your days with Bruner. mean, those were interesting days in the field. I mean, there were people at the bottom of Mem Hall, trained pigeons.
Yes.
And then, I don't know whether you were on the third floor of Emerson Hall.
That's right.
And then there were us on the first and second floor, the philosophers. Thinking that the people upstairs were crazy. And the people at Emerson, I mean, that was the religion. And I wonder how much of that tension was part of the intellectual life up in Saksai. The fact that you were not completely separating yourself for what was taken to be the definition of psychology and the whole behaviors.
Well, I think we felt pretty self-satisfied, actually. I think we felt, we believed that we were on the right track, right, and that the psychologists were missing the boat. Now, both tracks actually had something to say, and so eventually, many years later, the departments re-merged, and so it, and you lost that combination of anthropology, sociology combination with us. That didn't gel. That didn't last indefinitely. So did we feel tension with the philosophers? To tell you the truth, Sylvan, I had forgotten that the second floor was philosophers. I myself had a minor in philosophy, so I might have been interested in it, but I think all my attention was focused on what we were doing on the third floor.
Klein was pushing behavior for it to strike below you.
No, that's interesting that was the case. I got much more interested in philosophy again later. Jerry Fodor forced us to be interested in philosophy, and I think it's been very important in the field to think about.
Susan has a question.
Molly, when you joined the faculty, how many women were you among here at MIT?
I haven't mentioned women the whole time here. That's just very odd because I spent a lot of attention throughout my career to the fact, dealing with the fact that I was a woman and dealing with the issues for women in careers. And I'm still interested in that topic. So I guess many of us felt sort of as though we had joined the club in some sense, so that we were women, but we were one of the boys. And anyway, so I think with my immediate colleagues, I didn't feel they're treating me funny because I'm a woman. But with the general environment, it was obvious. At MIT, out of about 1,000 faculty members, there were 15 women, something of that order. It was minute, unbelievable across all departments. And so this is just weird. And I think
did you guys hang out together? Did you have a solidarity
Well,
group,
we tried. We tried in the around 1970, I think. The women faculty kind of got together and decided really this wasn't a great thing, and there should be more women on the faculty, and something should be done about it, But it was very hard to get. MIT was a vigorous going concern, and they were doing just fine without the women. So what's the big deal? And so it was a little hard to get people's attention at that time. Jerry Wiesner, the famous Jerry Wiesner, surprisingly said to a group of there was a meeting at one point in around 1972, I think it was, with him and perhaps with the academic council or something, in which the women's group sort of presented their case for what could be done to increase the number of women at all levels at the Institute. And he said something, I can remember saying something like, well, I know you're worried that your sons might not have positions, but then think about your daughters. Jerry Wiesner said, well, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. Well, of course, he's dead wrong. It has to be a zero-sum game. There are still only actually less than 1,000 faculty members at MIT. And so for every woman added, which there's something like 100 women or something, it's maybe a little more than 100, a little more than 10, maybe it's 15% altogether or something like that. for every one of those, if there had been no change, they'd all be men. So no, it was not a zero-sum game. And I think that this made it really hard because people were training these male graduate students. They wanted them to have the jobs, and there was just a kind of a, you know, who are these aliens they want us to hire, you know? And so there had to be a change, and there was a change. The biggest change, I think, was in the undergraduate women. There were 6%, and they regarded 6% of undergraduate women to be a natural for an institute of science and technology orientation, engineering. 6% is about what you could expect, because women aren't interested in those fields, right? So there was a sort of feeling we can't find good enough people to get here. Well, one thing we did encourage them to do was to start make an active recruiting women campaign, put out special leap lists about women at MIT, undergraduate women at MIT. And lo and behold, the applicants began to come in, and the process continued. And if you look at the change in the percentage of women over about a 15-year period, it just went up and up and up and up until it's now about 45%, right? So that's where it is, and that's what happened. That was women showing their interest with their feet and coming to MIT. There was a lot of talk about were they admitted unfairly, but with somebody's thumb on the scale so that they would admit more women? No, that wasn't the case. There was an issue about the fact that women performed better than their SATs indicated compared to men, and so they made a little adjustment for that so that they would get women who would be as good as the men, not better, right? So, and I think that's terrific. But once the environment like that changed, just gradually things changed and things have improved for women. It isn't, the effort hasn't ended. Part of it is the state of the society, the state of our culture, who we are as people, how we're brought up, how we learn to think about ourselves. Part of it may be some biological factors here. There's the question of bearing children and all that. Undoubtedly, there's some factors like that, but intellectually, it doesn't seem as though there's an issue about whether scientists are better in male bodies than female bodies. That doesn't seem to be the case. So I think change will continue, but perhaps people need to continue to work on that problem. Certainly, it doesn't look as though if you don't think about it, it'll naturally sort itself out. If you don't think about it, it'll regress. That's the experience we've had. And so I think women and men should keep awareness of this issue. But I think these days, anybody who is a woman who wants to do something has a good shot at it. And there's no reason they have to worry about the fact that gee, how can I have babies and do it too? It can be done. It can be done. And you can fit it in your lives the way a lot of us have, so. Okay. Yeah.
I guess continuing on the idea of training and education, whether we're trying to increase the percentage of women applying into engineering or science, or whether we're trying to increase the overall science knowledge in our population, do you have any thoughts that, excuse me, I guess to add about how neuroscience and cognitive psychology might be used to improve education, to have I guess, you raised 4 kids and you saw how your 4 kids got educated in a public or private school system. Now that we have these brain-based ideas to learning, I just wondered if you had anything to.
I wish I knew. I wish I had a real insight. What I see in my, when I read the New York Times or whatever, my information, wherever my information is coming, I worry a little about the sort of pop psychology approaches that I think exist in education, and anywhere when you get away from a little distance from the science, you begin to see these kind of phony ideas. I was reading just this morning over breakfast about some brain theory about how if you sleep, your spindles will fire in such a way as to free up your learning capacity later in the day. Now, you know, I read that and I think, God, that's like Nancy, if somebody was giving a talk about that, I would have my hand out and say, wait a minute, how do you know that that's what they're doing? You know, what's your real evidence for this? Well, so you know, I worry a little bit that it's hard to apply what we know about the brain and what we know about science to solve, you know, the broader questions of education and how to raise your kids and stuff. I wish we were better at making that transfer. It just seems difficult. But if you have ideas for it, go for it.
I mean, I just happen to have run into this recently. There is a movement of serious cognitive scientists who are thinking about education and what works. There was an article in Science a couple weeks ago, I forget the author, looking at 2 different ways of teaching some physics content. And they did, you know, randomized assignment of different lectures, different classrooms, in the way that you need to seriously look at how to teach. And there are other serious cognitive people like Hal Pashler and Bob Bjork and a number of others who have gotten together recently to actually do good, you know, cognitive science-based thinking about, you know, what our field has to say about education. So they haven't done a whole lot yet, but I was actually really thrilled to hear that serious people are going into this area.
Yeah.
Because it matters.
Yes, that's great.
And,
you know.
and to me, like the chance that neuroscience is going to have anything to say about education is approximately 0, right? I mean, you know, whenever you hear neuro X, like for all X, be afraid. You know? I won't go on my tirade about that. I'm sorry. You know, neuroscience is great for neuroscience. Okay, how is neuroscience going to help us understand education or improve education?
Many neuroscientists study learning. What
Yeah.
is it that
Absolutely.
Yeah.
improves
Absolutely.
the learning
But
capacity of their subjects where they are?
absolutely. But do any of those insights tell us how to teach people better? That's what I meant. I meant not that there's no value in neuroscience, but that if you want to understand how to teach people better, the insights are going to come from behavior rather than from brain stuff, at least at the moment. But I don't know.
You know, hearing you two, I seen you two on the same little stage here. How wonderful it would be that each faculty member in the cognitive side of our department would just give an hour-long talk on, you know, what that person thinks about mental life. Because I think a lot of us are, I mean, I don't know about in this room, but a lot of us are buried in details of molecules and all this stuff with tracks and spikes and so on. And it's impressive to hear both of you talk about the mind. Why can't we have a little mind series? It can't be hard because, no, we really, it can't be that difficult because everyone here teaches, right?
Yeah.
But I think it would be very good for the neuro people to hear you and remember, oh yeah, it's why I was interested. Right? I think you two may have really, I hope I started something that could happen in your study. Okay, good. So we'll put that on. Go.
I have no idea what time it is, so
It's getting. I think we've used up our audience time. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate having an audience. It's very kind of you.